Little warning, this episode talks about domestic abuse, which can be a sensitive topic. Hey guys, welcome to X Appeal. This is Jenn and Julien, and you're listening to episode 19.
So, trying to figure out how to start this podcast, because I know we're talking about some serious subject matter.
It's serious. We usually keep it a little bit more fun, a little lighter.
We talk about the lighter side of relationships. We laugh at it. You know, there's some stuff that comes up, but it's an
important month.
It is. So October is a month that's like dedicated to a lot of different things.
Halloween, but not
Halloween. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. But this one we're talking about is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And you'd be hard pressed, I think, to find somebody in this country or in any country, frankly, who hasn't been impacted in some way by a toxic or even abusive relationship. I think you'd agree with that.
Yeah. And to me, it's always like, what's toxic versus what's abusive, right? Where's the line? Where do you draw that line? What's someone being overly protective and technically abusing you emotionally versus what's him or her being overly jealous? What, there's so many distinctions when you think about non-physical abuse, and I think that's a very, very tricky subject.
So I've been a domestic violence advocate for the last, I would say, 10 years now. And if you could indulge me, I'll tell you where that came from. So 15 years ago, I was a news reporter in Hartford, Connecticut, and I didn't know anybody. I was the youngest reporter there by about 10 years. But luckily I was working with this woman who was the assignment editor for the station. And she kind of took me under her wing and like maybe a part of her family. We'd have like dinners at her house. She'd take me shopping and really made me feel at ease. She called herself, I'm your Connecticut mom. So like, don't worry, I got your back. Because, sometimes if you're working in news, especially if you're younger, it can feel like a snake pit at times. So just to give you an idea of how thoughtful this person was, for whenever I signed on to the morning show, she gifted me this like gift basket with lavender lotions and oils and like a blanket, because she knew I'd be taking a lot of naps. So she wanted me to feel like
so
nice and relaxed. We knew that she was married. We knew the relationship wasn't going that great, because I would hear her every once in a while talk about, Jim's out for the weekend, so me and the girls are going to have like a fun weekend. It always seemed like an escape for her whenever he was gone. And a couple of times I had witnessed, him diminishing her verbally. Nothing crazy. Just, I thought it was just his ego talking.
So do you remember anything specific?
Yeah, I remember one thing. So we were about to she wanted to say grace at the dinner table. And he said, you're presuming that she wants to say grace, Alice, like lay off it. And I was just, a little taken aback, and, I didn't say anything. I was like, no, of course I want to say grace. It's all good. It's all good. So that was like just the one thing that I witnessed. And that was the very first time I had ever met him.
But that's insane because like, for example, I'm not religious. If somebody at the table says, hey, you presuming that he wants to say grace, I'll be like, thanks.
Yeah.
I'll be like, thanks. Like, it's so far from even me thinking that that could be a hint that he is abusive.
Oh, right.
Especially if he had a rough day and people asking him questions, just like, maybe he just wants to eat.
Sure. And I know that.
But good on you for picking up on that
from work. But here's the thing. I didn't, because I didn't know. I just didn't know that it was anything other than him just, maybe being tired, or like I said, the ego talking. So that was maybe the one occasion that I had witnessed. Well, fast forward about 5 years later, she got a job as an executive assistant to our general manager. She got her own car. She was like super happy about it. She was, I think it was like a Dodge Charger that she was, and she was like feeling herself. And we could tell there was like a shift in the way that she was looking at herself, almost like, she's freeing herself from the situation. I didn't know at that moment they were going through a divorce, and that she was still living in the same house as he was. So one morning I walk into work, and she worked a different shift. So I didn't get to see her for like maybe the a couple of months. We would talk, but I wouldn't get to actually see her every day like I used to. So I walk in, and right away, my producer says, Jenn, we have something we got to tell you. And I was like, what could it possibly be? Because the way they were saying it almost seemed like juicy gossip. And I was like, who got fired, And then when I see all the managerial staff at 5:00 in the morning, I was like, this can't be good. And they said, we heard over the scanner that Alice had been, I'm sorry. We heard in the scanner that Alice's address had come up as a shooting, and we think it's her. And I was like, that can't be. And they said Alice is always very proud of you as a reporter. She knew that, and they were talking about her in the past tense, and I was just like, this can't be happening. They were like, she was always super proud of you. You would take on any kind of report, task, whatever, any kind of assignment, no matter whatever it was, and you would do it with a smile on your face. And so we knew that she loved you, and she would want you to do this. And I was like, okay. So they sent me out to the police department because her father hadn't been notified yet. So for maybe 3 hours, I had to report on this. Basically what happened was, she had been texting a colleague of ours at the station for help, and saying that, Jim, her husband, came in with a gun, and he was threatening to harm her and himself. And she said, I don't want to die. I don't know what to do. Can you please call the police? Because I think it's serious this time. And by the time this colleague had called the police, she actually got on the phone with 911, because at that point you couldn't text 911. And she got on the phone, and I made the mistake of listening to the 911 call, but you basically hear her trying to explain what was going on, that he was threatening her life. He dragged her into a room, and then the last thing you hear is gunshots and a thud. And what happened was, he had shot her, and then he went into a separate bedroom and shot himself. So it was a murder-suicide.
Fucking coward.
Yep. And then the girls who she had there, I think 9 and 15 years old, they were running from the house. I don't think they saw anything, but that morning I had to report all morning from her house, and seeing the crime tape and seeing the guys in spacesuits walk in and out of the house that I, would go to and hang out with her, was just absolutely surreal. And her parents were there. And it was just one of those moments. And then you think back to yourself, you do like this forensic analysis, right? Like, what could I have done? Yeah. There had to have been something that she said, some moment that she let me in where I could have stopped this, and that's what, family and friends are left with. So I made it. The only thing that I could do at that point was make it my mission to talk about it. And if, God forbid, any of my friends were going through anything like that, if I was going through anything like that, fight like hell to get them out of it or get myself out of it.
Yeah.
So
okay. Well,
sorry for the little emotional breakdown, but
very heavy stuff. Yeah.
10 years later, you don't forget about it. I think about her every single day, and domestic violence is such a tricky thing to talk about, because there's so many different ugly faces to it, and like we were talking about, it's not just textbook, shoving and pushing and physical violence. It can also be a lot of different things. It can be emotional. It can be micro. It can be,
and it gradually builds up. I think it can start with something very, very small. And as the years go by, it gets more and more and more intense. Right. Which in a way might be why, like, throughout this whole time, you barely even picked up on it, because the few times you were in there, it was so small. And then one day it just exploded.
Yeah.
And well, first of all, obviously, I'm sorry you actually have to go through that, because that's pretty obviously dramatic. But that is also the reason why we're bringing, we're actually bringing a specialist, Dr. Peterson, who's going to help us, talk about abuse and what is abuse and what type of, like, what forms it take and how to help and all this tricky and difficult subject to talk about, because like you said, first of all, it is the month. The month where we're talking about all this, and it's just important. It's an important topic.
Yeah, any chance that's, you can't talk about the happy side of relationships because it's not all clean, it's not all beautiful and sunshine and roses. It can also get pretty ugly sometimes too, and I think that's definitely worth talking about.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to bring in Dr. Zoë Peterson. So she is the director of the Sexual Assault Research Initiative at the Kinsey Institute. Now we know that abuse can take many, many forms. There's, the list kind of goes on and on, right? Sexual, physical, financial, and oftentimes it's extremely difficult to get out of. And we were talking about this earlier. It takes, on average, statistically, 7 attempts for a person to leave their abusive partner before they do it for good. So my first question to you would be, and this is said a lot, if you're in an abusive situation, why don't you just leave?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say I've heard that 7 times statistic said a lot. And I haven't been able to find the actual source for that 7 times statistic. So I do like to say that there's not a right number of times, and I don't want to discourage people who are thinking about leaving. So, some people do leave the first time, and for some people it takes many more than 7. So I think there's a wide range. But I think the important message is that it's really hard to leave, and it's easy to say, why don't people leave? But there's all kinds of barriers. And I mean, as you noted, often part of abuse is economic abuse. So one thing that makes it really hard to leave is that often the victims of domestic violence don't have access to finances that they would need to support themselves, or sometimes their children as well. Often kids are a reason that people don't leave relationships, so they don't want to break up a relationship for the kids, or they're afraid that if they leave, that will mean that, for example, their abusive partner gets a lone visitation with their children, and so they worry about their children's safety. They think their children are safer if they stay there in the relationship.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's a huge one. Also, often, as you said, there's this kind of psychological component to the abuse. So they've been often kind of down, maybe isolated from their friends and family. So they may not have support system to reach out to. And then I think there's a couple of really important ones, which is often they're scared to leave, and they're right to be scared in many ways. So often abusers are very dependent and insecure, and one of the things that can really escalate their violence is their partner trying to leave. So leaving can often be one of the most dangerous things that someone in an abusive relationship can do. And then the last one, which I think we can't overstate, is that often they love their partner. People don't start out relationships as abusers, and people don't fall in love with someone who's an abuser. They fall in love with the person, and they have all the hopes and dreams we all have in relationships. And it's hard to give those up. And I think even those of us who have never been in a domestic violence relationship know that it's often hard to leave intimate relationships, even when they're not going the way we want them to.
Yeah. Dr. Peterson, somebody explained it, or compared it rather, to digging a hole in the ground, and you're getting deeper and deeper, and you don't even realize, how deep you are until you look up and you don't see daylight anymore. So my question to you would be, how does one know that they're actively being abused?
Especially if it's not physical.
Right, because oftentimes it's not textbook.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think it is. I think, we think of abuse stereotypically as physical abuse, but there are all these other components. And I think a lot of times people talk about abusive behavior as kind of falling under this umbrella of coercive control. So this sort of controlling behavior, wanting to, keep track of you at all times, and not wanting you to leave and go places without them, not wanting you to see friends and family without them present, checking up on you constantly. And this kind of controlling behavior then can take all these different forms that include psychological abuse, so putting you down, insulting you, controlling the finances, as we discussed. And so sometimes abuse looks like those things, and it never reaches the level of physical abuse because it never needs to.
No,
the goal is really to control.
Mm-hmm. And you make these small little allowances.
Right.
And gradually these allowances become bigger and bigger. And the friends, isolating yourself from your friends and family is really important to hear, because those people have known you for way longer potentially than your abuser. And they're the ones, if anybody, who are going to pull you out of a rough situation. And so when you get isolated like that, you literally have no lifeline anymore.
Yeah, I think that's true. And sometimes also then that makes it hard for you to sort of check the things that feel wrong, because there's no one to check them off of. Like, this doesn't feel right, but maybe I'm just imagining it, and it makes it harder to kind of get that reality check, I think.
And also this the mental abuse you're talking about, like, keep constantly checking up on them, not when they're gonna leave, all that stuff. I feel like sometimes you as the partner, if you're a victim of that, it could be taken for extreme jealousy, right? And therefore a lot of people's like, well, if he's jealous because he loves me, because he cares about me, or she, so
flattering at that point.
So it's like,
he cares. So
where's the line?
Yeah.
Where is it too much?
Right. I think that's a great question. And I think that's part of this sort of, early in relationships, this sort of intense attention can feel really good. And so it can be really easy to miss some of those, I think, incredibly easy to miss some of those early signs, like, extreme jealousy is not a great sign, but early in a relationship, it can just feel like they're really attentive to you and really interested in you. And so sometimes those things really don't become clear till further down the line.
Especially in like today's age, where it feels like we're so easily replaceable, with all the options out there on social and all this. It's like you meet one who really, really is all about you, and it could feel good, but you're not really even realizing that you're actually in like danger.
Yeah. And that's typically where it starts. Social media has changed the game. It goes from, well, why did you like this person's photo, or why are you following this person, to something deeper. Now you're checking the other person's DMs. You're going through their text messages, and it just snowballs into something that you really have no control over anymore. And you don't feel it maybe as intently as if they started off, getting in your business and checking all of your personal stuff.
But also, is somebody being all in your business considered abuse if you're not comfortable with it? Or is it just somebody who's overprotective? How do you justify it? And then if you have to talk to someone, like, when do you know?
Yeah.
Go to the police and be like, hey, my partner is just looking at me all on my Instagram constantly, and he or she won't let me have drinks with my friends.
Yeah.
They'll be like, okay.
They'll look at you like you have three heads.
Yeah, that is really a challenge, I think, because I think you're right. Like, I think if someone is checking up on you and, controlling your social media and asking all these questions and not letting you have drinks, those are really bad signs. And I think really worth paying attention to, especially if you communicate that you're uncomfortable with it and it continues. And yet you're right. That's not the kind of thing anyone's going to call the police for. And so I think that makes it hard for people sometimes to like trust that their instincts about that are right.
Yeah. You also can't be afraid to maybe have a little bit of confrontation, because a lot of people will just sit back and let themselves be treated a certain way for the sake of an argument. Like, I just don't want to put up with a fight. I don't want to have a bad night, so I'm just going to not say anything. And what else would you recommend in terms of setting the standard for the way that you should allow yourself to be treated? Do you do it early on in a relationship, or what do you recommend?
Yeah, so this is tricky. I mean, I think, of course, everyone has a right to and should set their own boundaries within relationships. But I also think, we have to be careful not to blame people for not telling people how to treat them, because sometimes, as you said, it's gradual and the problem isn't evident until it becomes a situation where they don't feel safe to set those boundaries and tell the person what they need. So I think, yes, we should all set boundaries. We should all, tell our partners what we're comfortable with and what we're not. But also sometimes the point at which we kind of realize it's uncomfortable, we become fearful about being able to set those boundaries. And so that makes it really hard.
So if you're somebody who's listening right now and you feel like you might be in a toxic relationship, Dr. Peterson, what would you recommend, they A, pay attention to, and B, how do they work on getting out of it?
Yes. So I think in some ways this is very individual for all the reasons I said. It's different when there's kids involved. It's different when you have more access to resources and more social support. But I guess I would say, if you feel threatened and in danger a lot, and if you feel very controlled, and feel like you're not kind of able to make your own decisions, if you feel like your partner is putting you down and making you feel badly about yourself, those are all really, really concerning signs. And I think one thing that people can always do is reach out for support. So there are national hotlines on domestic violence, and you can reach out to those, and no one is going to make you leave the relationship if that's not what you want to do or are ready to do. But it's a place to get support and talk to people. And, if you're really in danger, kind of get help planning for your own safety in case you need a plan in place. Or if you think you're ready to leave, to get support and suggestions about how to go about that as well.
Does it ever happen that somebody who is being abused doesn't really realize it because that's the only love relationship they know, or they have a dysfunctional relationship toward how a partnership should be? So, how we'll say sometimes like some guys or some girls likes to be more dominated in their relationship. And the other person is the one who makes all the decision, who decides where we're going, who's deciding all of this, who's providing financially. And the other partner is just okay with just letting that happen. Is that possible? That, I don't know if I'm making myself clear, where it's just like, that's the relationship they're in.
They saw a pattern happening with their parents. Or
yeah, and that's just what they're used to. And they're getting technically abused emotionally, but they don't even know it.
Yes, I think often people who are in relationships that we might say are abusive or are violent don't think of it that way. And sometimes I think there's a lot of reasons for that. They may not have very good models of what a relationship can and should look like. Also, I think we have all these stereotypes about what domestic violence looks like, that it looks, very physically violent, for example. And they may say, well, that's not what it looks like, so this must be okay. Yeah. Or their partner has put them down and they're therefore very insecure and think, well, maybe this is the best I can do. So I think there's all kinds of reasons that people don't recognize that the relationship they're in is abusive, even when it might look very abusive from the outside.
What's interesting is it kind of took, so I've been in several actually abusive relationships, and I didn't even realize that was the name for it. Once you put a name on it, I feel like that's when it kind of spurs you into thinking, all right, now it's time to go. Because it was, for me, it was like mostly emotional, mostly verbal. And it wasn't until I explained this, I went to see a therapist. And she said, Jen, what you're describing right now is abuse. And when I put a name on it is when I was able to make that decision to leave. And that's why I think it is important to go to maybe a third party, an outside party, to seek help in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think it's sort of bi-directional, right? Like putting that name on it helps you see that maybe this isn't a situation you want to be in. And also, when you get to the point that you recognize you might not want to be in that situation, it's probably easier to put that label on it as well. Right. Before that, you might think, well, I love this person and I don't want to think of them as someone who is abusive or call them an abuser. And so part of like getting to the point of being able to use that label, I think, is recognizing that there is a problem.
Is it, I feel like personally as a man, when I think about abusing relationship, automatically I'm assuming a man abusing a woman. And I'm sure that there are men that are being abused, but what's the like percentage, and what does abuse towards men look like? Because if it's physical, we'd like to think as a man that I want to say, if we're not like handicapped, but if we're fully capable, that we are technically stronger. So if we're getting physically abused, we technically are able to fight back or pin the person to the ground so that they stop acting out. How does that look? And if there are some men that are being physically abused, how come they're not doing anything? Is there because there's shame about them being abused by somebody who's less strong, in quote, or how does that look?
Yes, this is such an important question and a really difficult one, to be honest, and really contested. So if you look at who presents at domestic violence shelters, who comes into hospitals with injuries from domestic violence, it is overwhelmingly women who have been abused by men. But interestingly, in large-scale research where they give people questionnaires and say, have you had these things happen in your relationship? Have you had a partner do these to you? Have you done them to a partner? They actually find is that men and women perpetrate abuse at about the same rates against their other sex partners. So men report about the same rates of being hit and slapped and pushed as women do. So how to reconcile these things is really difficult. And I think people have offered different explanations, and it's probably a combination of all of them, which is, first of all, that, there may be different types of abuse within relationships. So some relationships may be kind of emotionally volatile, and there's kind of this mutual violence within the relationship. And it's probably lower level. People get angry. They don't have good conflict resolution skills. And so they find each other, screaming at each other and maybe hitting each other. And it's possible that that's a sort of different thing than this very controlling kind of behavior that we think of with, often women who end up in domestic violence shelters or in the hospital, for example. But also, I think we do have these gender stereotypes. So we have these stereotypes that men should be physically strong, women should be passive, men should be the aggressive ones. And so I do think also part of the picture is that prevents men from coming forward to get help from domestic violence shelters and hospitals. And we do know from lots of research that men are victims both of abuse by women and by male partners as well.
Yeah, I was going to say it might be the physical could maybe be more prominent in like a homosexual relationship, because now you have possibly a man who wants to be more physical.
Right.
And but so then you would say that in a couple the abuse would be mostly verbal, or is it towards men, or is it still pretty equal on physical as well?
So when you look at large scale surveys, it's pretty equal on physical. Now, often these surveys measure things like hitting, slapping, pushing, hair pulling. And so I guess, some people have raised questions, for example, is a slap from a woman against a man the same as a slap from a man against, toward a woman? Is that the same level? And it's really hard to sort all that out. But I think in any case, men are reporting that they experience, physical aggression from women. And I think that's important, regardless of whether we're saying which is worse or who has it more severe.
Yeah, but it's important to know that it is prevalent and it is just as equal to what women report, especially because, I would have to imagine that as a man, if you report physical violence against you from a woman, there is a worry that I would be sure flashes through your mind. Is this going to make me look weak, that I can't control, somebody who, so to speak, is a little bit weaker than me physically?
Yeah.
Does that make me less of a man? Does that make me, more of a weak person? Does So I'm sure there's that's a concern as well.
I mean, yeah, I've luckily never been in these relationships, but if I have to think about it, I'm like, if it's I want to say normal woman who's trying to hit me, I'd like to think I can defend myself. And obviously we're taught not to hit back. So I wouldn't hit back because now I become abusive, but then at least pin the person to the ground. But like, obviously if it's like a Chris Cyborg MMA fighter, really, really big women, she could probably definitely be way stronger than me. So
yep,
I could see that too.
Okay, so Dr. Peterson, if you're a loved one of somebody who you suspect is being abused, that's a tricky situation too, because on one hand, you don't want to seem like you're being pushy or nosy or in their business. On the other hand, you are concerned for their safety. So how do you handle that?
Yes, I think if you have concerns, it's always good to reach out to someone. I think, I think we're kind of taught to sort of like mind our own business and not get involved. But I think, so often if people are in a bad situation, they need the support. And if you're wrong and they're not in a bad situation, at least they know you care about them. So I think it's always good to reach out, to express your concerns. I think it's sometimes helpful because, as we discussed, sometimes people aren't ready to call this abuse. So, maybe avoiding that term, but naming the behaviors that are making you concerned, expressing concern, offering support. And then I think, if the person confirms your concerns that this is an issue, I think, again, really respecting their autonomy and giving them control about how to move forward. So what you don't want to do is replicate what the perpetrator is doing and sort of try and take away their control.
Good point.
But, so not telling them what to do, but expressing concern and maybe offering resources that they could consider.
Right. Like, you always have, hey, I have a spare bedroom, I have my couch, whatever, I'll take it. You can sleep in my bed, like whatever it is, bring the kids, just so you have a home here, just to let them know that there's somebody out there who cares about them and is going to be there if they fall.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if they decide, not to leave, but to stay for now, at least, I think, checking in regularly and keeping in mind that they may not always reciprocate because they may not have, access to reach out to you, but you can reach out to them and just let them know you're there. And I think also to keep in mind that their partner may be monitoring contact. So you have to be careful how you do the contact, but just, regularly checking in and expressing that you're thinking about them, I think can be really useful.
Now you specialize in sexual aggression and sexual violence. And yeah, I know that sometimes people are hesitant to report sexual abuse if the abuser is someone they're in a committed relationship with, say a spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend. So would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. So it's absolutely the case that the closer the person is to the perpetrator, the less likely they are to report it through formal means.
And how does the reporting works? Like, what's the law? How does that work when you go to the police? What's the process? I remember, this is so random, and I remember seeing this video. There was a video call to a woman. The woman was calling the police, right? And her husband was being abused, and she called the police saying, I want to order a pizza. Have you seen those?
Oh yeah.
And then the police like, this is not a pizza. It's like, no, I want to order a pizza. This is the address. And now the police officer, understood what was going on to try to at least guide her through it. But once you decide that you want to contact the police, what's the whole process? Do you know a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this is not really my area of expertise. I mean, I think typically, with domestic violence, often the police are called because it's sort of a crisis situation. And then, the police sort of have to sort that out in the moment. But of course, you can also go to the police after you've left for, restraining orders and other orders of protection. So there's kind of multiple ways that you can potentially use the police.
I also want to ask you this, because when you say orders of protection, restraining orders, it has been my experience, because I used to work at a domestic violence shelter in Connecticut, that when that protective order is signed off on, or that restraining order is signed off on, yes, it does mean that if the abuser or the person who has the restraining order out against them, if they violate certain parameters, then the police have to get involved.
Yeah.
However, there is a risk of only further angering that person. And if they're going to come after you, they're going to come after you. If they want to do something terrible to you, they're going to do something terrible to you. And the police may or may not be there. So that's also, to me, a very difficult situation to navigate.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, they're obviously, protective orders are obviously imperfect. And so I think it's not bad as one kind of protective strategy, but I think you're right. You don't want that to be the only thing you're relying on. You need a sort of broader safety plan of, a place to go that, where you might not be easy to be found, and some of those other considerations.
And that's just a tangent. But
do you know how long it takes to get a restraining order?
It depends on the situation, how violent it was leading up to whatever the protective order or the restraining order, the reason for it. It could be immediate, or, it could take effect in a few days. Okay, but it's not like a month process. No, but somebody from the legal world has to sign off on it. Okay. So however long that might take. Right. So, okay, Dr. Peterson. So we were saying that you specialize in sexual aggression. Is there anything that you've come across in your research that surprised you? So I think, in terms of thinking about sexual assault and sexual aggression, I think one thing that I think is really important to recognize is that it's a whole broad range of behaviors. And we often think about, sort of the most extreme. So, forcible rape, for example, where someone uses physical force to obtain sex. But there's a lot of, as with all kinds of violence, a lot of kind of lower level behaviors that are potentially harmful that don't reach that level. And I think often in relationships, especially when you're talking about sexual abuse within relationships, often it is those lower level behaviors that you see. So pressuring someone constantly for sex, or intimidating them so that they're afraid to say no to sex, for example. So again, kind of like with other aspects of intimate partner violence, often they don't have to use physical force because there's all these other kind of lower level behaviors that they can use to sort of control the person, in this case, sexually. Or a sex act that they might not be comfortable with.
Yes, I was going to say, what you're saying, intimidating them in exchange for sex. What does that look like, or what's is there a sentence that you could tell us that just?
Yeah, I think just if someone gets really angry every time you say no to sex, you might feel like you continue to say no to sex, especially if they get very angry and they are prone to physically abusive behaviors.
Mm-hmm. And never be afraid to say no matter how deep the commitment is on both of your parts. Never be afraid to say no. And that person, whenever you say no, that means no under every circumstance.
But like you were saying, it could also lead to them getting more angry and now forcing it.
Yeah, but it needs to be said that you don't like the way things are going, or you don't, you have to at some point use your voice, And
I think, I think
I understand it can be a scary situation. I get that.
Yeah. And I think it's an important point that, that even when people say no, that, sometimes the other person doesn't hear that, or doesn't sort of respect that. And I think, in part, if that happens enough, then it feels almost, people start to feel like it's pointless to say no. Like it doesn't matter what I say. And so I think in relationships, it can be a sort of longer term kind of coercive experience where at some point people sort of give up and just feel like they don't have other options.
Yeah.
If anything, I think the Me Too movement has brought to light, certain circumstances that have been maybe inappropriate or unacceptable for decades. But that also brings in issues of consent and what that means. That's I'm sure that's something that you're researching right now too.
Yes. So yes, actually, what is consent is a real interest of mine. And I think it's so hard and it's so complicated. And, how does power differences play into that? And, how much coercion is too much coercion? How much pressure if you make someone feel just obligated? So you talked about, even in relationships, you can always say no, but, sometimes there's this sense of obligation. So all of these like complicated factors that make it hard for people to withdraw consent, I think.
And I'm sharing something personal. Don't know how relevant it is, but I remember I was like a few years ago, probably 3. I was dating someone, and every time we would start to get intimate, she would say no, and I'd be like, oh, okay. So then I stopped. But then she would come back on me and then start to start the whole process again. And then when I tried, she'd be like, no. I'm like, okay, so now stop. And then she would come back again and she would come back again. And then I think one day I said something. I was like, yeah, but you keep saying no. So like, I don't want to keep doing it. But that's just what she was into. She wanted me to be like a little bit more, yeah. And then kind of like, not forcefully, because it was understood.
There's also issues of dominance, because there are some women who like to be dominated in the bedroom, and that's a personal taste.
But then as a guy, especially you're talking about the Me Too movement, as a guy, like especially when we're not into that and we're always being very careful to make sure everybody's on the same page. That's like I'm terrified.
Yeah. And I think in general, we don't in our culture teach people to talk about sex and what they do and don't want sexually. And, it's like most people don't have the skills to say, here's what I'm really into. Here's what I'm not into. What are you into and not into? And so I think that makes communication around sexual consent especially hard, because we're all trying to infer it without actually saying it.
Yeah, it's kind of like you try it out and you see the response. And honestly, sometimes it doesn't go well.
But having that happen in real time is probably not the best idea. It's probably good to have a conversation, especially if you're going to be in a relationship with that person. But we talk about this, me and Julien talk about this all the time, the difference between American culture and European culture when it comes to how open we are about talking about sex.
Yeah, I keep saying that the American culture is the most censored, sexualized. It's very censored, obviously not the most, but it's a very censored, sexualized group. But they're also the ones watching some of the most weird stuff.
And maybe that's because we're so repressed
that they're the sickest minds. The sickest minds.
I don't know. It's
we just because in French ads back in the days we had boobs on
that's
on
true.
billboards. It doesn't matter. People are topless at the beach. It doesn't do anything.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's like everyone gets all their sex education from this media that are unrealistic and unhelpful, and then people don't know how to talk to their partners about.
It also ties to what you were saying, right? So if you're with a friend and you think your friend is being abused emotionally, is it possible that two couples have a very, very different notion of what abuse is? So maybe you look at this person and this relationship like, oh, she's being abused, but maybe she's like, no, like generally for them it works and this is how it's done. Does that happen?
You mean for the friend who
is it possible that you're concerned for someone, but for them they're totally safe and they feel totally safe, and it is an actual safer relationship, it was a very safe relationship, but for you from the outside, this is not what you used to in your own relationship. So the fact that it's different make you feel like it could be.
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible. And I think in general, it's hard. It's really hard, if not impossible, to judge relationships from the outside. I think in all kinds of ways, we often do this with our friends, right? Like we think something's good or not good. And we often are only seeing a tiny little piece of it. And I think there are all kinds of individual differences in terms of what people want from their relationships, cultural differences in terms of what people want. So, I mean, certainly there's some things that I would say are always a problem, but often those are not the things we see from the outside. And so, yeah, I think absolutely we can misinterpret, what we think we're seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there was one in one of the abusive, relationships that I had been in, my marriage. There was a moment of clarity that happened when I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, I'm not happy here. This is not a good, healthy relationship for me. And I'd be way better off alone and out of it. And to me, that felt like the most truthful, honest thing that I had ever said to myself in the course of this 5-year relationship. I think we do a lot of covering up for ourselves, whatever pacifies the way we feel at that moment to normalize everything. And that can carry on for years and years and years. And sometimes all it takes is one thing to just trigger you into that moment of clarity.
Yeah.
But, it's tough as a friend to make that happen for the other person. It's almost like a child, right? You want your kids to learn from your mistakes and don't follow the same path that I did. But there's no better way to learn than by being in it. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can't bring someone to that point. They have to come to that point.
So just have a reasonable expectation that you're going to be met with resistance at times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything
The culture one was also very good. It's true that if you think of how Middle Eastern marriage work compared to an American one, I'm sure it's so
everybody
different.
Has their own ideas of what's acceptable and what's appropriate.
Exactly. And that's also where it becomes tricky again for somebody to step in. So I think what you were saying, Jen, is actually correct in the sense of just offering support if they need it is probably the most gentle way to help someone.
Absolutely.
But your intuition, I would say, above anything else, trust your intuition. If you feel like something's not right, and you might not come to that realization tomorrow or right then or even a year from now, but you'll get there. You'll get there one way or the other for sure. Because there's only so much that a human being can take and how, horribly or how often they can be treated a certain way before they eventually they've had enough.
Yeah. And there's also the whole, we even touched on that, the whole parents abusing kids, not necessarily sexually, but also emotionally. Because I'm sure that's a big thing too.
Yeah, and there's quite a bit of data to support the idea that often being exposed to childhood violence, abuse from parents or from other people in their lives is a risk factor for perpetrating violence in intimate relationships later. Not that all children who experience that will by any means, but it is certainly related.
But then how do you help a kid who's being victim of emotional abuse if it's by both parents? Because I'm assuming one parent would probably step up, but because they're young, you can't, what's the...
sometimes what happens is like the kid will go to a teacher for help.
And just say something, or then the teacher will try to investigate a little bit more.
That you're talking about, that's a
tough
situation because they don't know where the abuse is originating, and all you can do is just be that ear, and then what would you suggest there? Because I know that happens a lot, where it's the teacher almost becomes the real parent to these kids.
Yeah, I think in general, when kids are experiencing abuse of any kind, emotional, physical, sexual, I think it can be so helpful to have an adult believe them and take it seriously. And I think, there's some reason to believe that, one of the worst things for a kid is to experience abuse, trust an adult and tell them, and then have that dismissed or not taken seriously. So I think even just the act of believing them and letting them know that you trust them and you think this is serious and it's a problem and that they don't deserve that, even that can, I think, really make a difference. And I think, if we're talking about this pathway between experiencing violence and then becoming violent, those kinds of experiences that sort of upset that pathway. So having someone believe you, having someone show you lots of empathy, those are the kinds of things that can help prevent that from kind of coming to that outcome.
Yeah, especially when you know that whoever is being abused, odds are they're being isolated from the ones they love the most.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's the ones they love the most who are the abusers. So I think that maybe the most important thing to take away from this conversation is that there is no awkward conversation. You know, if you sense that somebody might be in trouble or they're being abused, don't be silent about it. Just, in your own gentle way, let them know that you're there for them. Let them know that you're that lifeline.
And also, I want to say, like, pay attention to what abuse is, because again, like, immediately I think abuse, I think physical. It's so hard to think of emotional abuse, and it was very important that we talked about this, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Peterson,
thank you so much for your time.
I really appreciate it. I thought that was a good conversation, and one that should be had not just in October, by the way, but all year round. Very important.
Absolutely. And thanks for
where can we find you if listeners want to look you up?
Yeah, so you can look up the Kinsey Institute. All my contact information is there.
Perfect.
Dr. Zoë Peterson, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.